July 10, 2020. At a women's correctional facility in upstate New York, alarm spread when an inmate was found unresponsive in her cell. But what truly shocked everyone was the blood pooling beneath her body, a torn vagina, severe enough to threaten her life. How could something like this happen inside a locked environment where every move is monitored? Where were the officers on duty? Did the cameras catch anything that could explain what led to this moment? And the most urgent question of all, would the inmate survive long enough to tell anyone what happened to her? If she could speak, maybe she could explain what took place inside that cell. But the truth that eventually came out would not only shake the facility, it would expose a level of power, silence, and betrayal no one was prepared to face.
5:30, we're north on the hallway, 53rd Street, Marty Mercy inside.
The Northwood Women's Correctional Facility in upstate New York was not the kind of place anyone hoped their loved one would ever be sent to. Why? Because Northwood wasn't a correctional center. It was a last stop. The women who ended up here had either run out of options or run out of mercy from the courts. Judges used to warn new convicts, if you can't handle discipline, pray you don't get Northwood. The reason was simple. It was harsh, loud, and violent. It was where the system sent women who couldn't even survive other prisons. Take the homicide case that happened some years ago. The one that still makes staff lower their voices when it comes up. The mastermind was Elizabeth Foster, a 42-year-old babysitter from Rochester who'd murdered 3 children she was supposed to protect. The story had been all over national news. Police found the kids in her basement after an argument with their mother over pay. When the judge read her sentence, life without parole, Elizabeth didn't cry, didn't blink. She just stared straight ahead. Reporters called her the babysitter with no soul. And when the transport van drove her away, its destination was Northwood. Inside those walls, she wasn't a headline anymore. She was just another monster among many. But Elizabeth wasn't the only reason the place had a reputation. An inmate named Denise Rowe attacked a correctional officer with a sharpened toothbrush after being denied phone time. The officer survived, but Denise spent 2 years in segregation and never apologized. Another woman, Samantha Vega, was infamous for running a black market trade in stolen medication. She hid pills inside toothpaste tubes and sold them for cigarettes. The staff discovered her scheme only when 2 inmates overdosed. Still, the trade continued, proving that even inside the most controlled environment, someone always found a way to hustle. That was Northwood. Violent, unpredictable, and always one spark away from chaos. Officers said every hallway carried tension like static. You could feel when a fight was coming before it happened. It started with silence, then one shout, then a brawl that could spread across an entire tier in seconds. Control was just a word on paper. Inside, control belonged to whoever was most feared that week, because in a place filled with anger, power, and forgotten souls, even the smallest act of compassion could change everything. And soon, one inmate, a 29-year-old named Tara Mills, would find that out the hard way. She wasn't the toughest woman inside, nor the loudest, but her name would become the one whispered through the cell blocks. The guards knew it. The inmates felt it. Something about her story would shake Northwood to its core. And it all began with a secret that should never have existed inside those walls. Among the hundreds of inmates processed through Northwood Women's Correctional Facility in 2020, there was one name that most people would not have expected to see behind bars. Her name was Tara Mills, and before her arrest, she had never been known as violent, dangerous, or disruptive. She wasn't the type of person people imagined when they pictured prison life. Yet her story, once uncovered, made headlines and sparked conversations across the state about who ends up in places like this and why. Tara did not come from the streets or from a world of organized crime. She came from a life that left her constantly trying to hold herself together in ways the world never really taught her how to do. Tara was born in 1991 in a small town outside Rochester, New York, into what began as a religious household. Her mother attended church regularly, and there was a time when Tara's early life seemed steady. But stability didn't last. Her father left when she was just 5, and shortly after, her mother spiraled into a severe battle with addiction that disrupted their home entirely. By age 7, Tara was placed into foster care, and from that moment on, she was moved from home to home, school to school, always adjusting, always trying to survive. Records later showed one caseworker wrote, "Tara wants to be loved, but she's learned to expect it to be temporary." Foster care was not gentle. Some homes were decent. Others were cold and overcrowded. Tara learned early that in order to make it through a place full of strangers, you had to adapt or fade. She became quiet, observant, and careful. She watched how people behaved before she trusted them. She figured out which adults cared and which ones only cared about the monthly check. And every time she was moved again, she packed her things neatly, without crying, because she already knew nothing she called home would ever last long. By the time Tara reached high school, she was smart, but emotionally exhausted. She could write well, understand people quickly, and communicate in ways that made others feel seen. But that same need to be accepted made her vulnerable. She started seeking approval from people who were not always good for her. She fell into a relationship with an older boyfriend who encouraged her to take part in small financial schemes, claiming it was an easy way to get by. Tara didn't see it as crime. She saw it as someone finally choosing her. When the scams grew larger and authorities stepped in, she was the one left holding responsibility. The charges against her were for check fraud, identity misrepresentation, and theft totaling several $1,000s, enough to guarantee prison time. In court, when the judge read her sentence of 6 years, Tara didn't plead or break down. She stood still, hands clasped in front of her, and said quietly, "I didn't think it would go this far." She wasn't telling the court she was innocent. She was admitting that she didn't understand how fast survival choices can turn into crimes that reshape a life. That was the moment she stopped being seen as a girl who was trying to find her place and started being seen as inmate number 74281. Before moving on, a quick thank you to everyone watching and supporting this channel. Your presence truly keeps it alive. This community continues to grow because of people who believe in real, meaningful storytelling. Becoming a channel member unlocks exclusive extras, behind-the-scenes content, and directly helps us bring more powerful true stories to light. Your support makes a real difference. And we'd love to know who's here. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. If you're still tuned in right now, write "I'm still here" in the comments. Let's see who's watching till the end. Don't forget to like this video too. Now, let's continue. Inside Northwood, Tara adapted quickly. She didn't fight, didn't argue, didn't push against the system. Instead, she observed it. She figured out who controlled what and how to avoid unnecessary conflict. She spent most of her time in the library and education wing, helping inmates write letters, appeals, and sometimes even reconnect with family. Women came to her with stories that were too complicated to say out loud, and Tara turned them into clear sentences on paper. A correctional officer once told a coworker, "That one could be running this place if she wanted." He didn't mean it as praise. He meant she understood people well enough to know how to survive among them. Her ability to communicate made her liked, but not too liked. In prison, being liked too much could be dangerous. Tara stayed neutral, respectful, calm. She helped other inmates because it gave her purpose. It was the one part of her life that made sense. But beneath her steady behavior, she still carried the same emotional hunger she had since childhood. The desire for someone to choose her, to see her not as an inmate or a burden, but as a person worth protecting. That kind of need does not disappear in correctional custody. It grows. Tara did not trust easily, but when someone showed her attention, a kind that felt genuine, personal and gentle, it mattered. And because she had spent her life being disappointed by people who promised care, but walked away, when someone finally stayed, she didn't question the cost. She didn't consider whether the situation was equal or safe. She didn't understand how much power the other person held. She just recognized something that felt familiar: connection. In a place where everything is controlled, affection feels rare, valuable, and life-changing. and Tara had always been someone who believed in the possibility of being chosen. This emotional vulnerability shaped what came next. Tara was not reckless or naive. She was someone who had spent her entire life trying to hold on to any form of belonging she could find. And inside those walls, where every day felt the same, where hope was small and time was heavy, the desire to feel seen became one of the strongest forces in her life. Tara did not know that the person who would soon offer that attention was someone who should never have crossed that boundary, someone who understood exactly how much power they had, someone who knew she would believe him. And as word began to spread quietly across the prison yard that a guard seemed to linger near Tara's cell longer than others, no one knew just how deeply it would change her life. But some inmates noticed the look in her eyes when she walked past him. Some recognized it from their own past. One inmate said later, "She didn't see danger, she saw comfort. That's how it starts." And soon enough, that comfort would shape the story that would define everything that happened next. Now, we're sure you want to know who the man was, the one whose presence would eventually intersect with Tara Mills's life inside those walls. But before we get there, let's talk about someone else, someone who played a different but crucial role in this story. His name was Daniel Brooks. Daniel wasn't a rookie or a reckless officer. He was a 38-year-old correctional officer with over 10 years of experience at Northwood Women's Correctional Facility, known for running his unit like clockwork. To his colleagues, he was the no-nonsense guy, the officer who didn't tolerate disrespect or excuses. Inmates often described him as strict but fair. He demanded order, and he got it. One officer once said during shift change, "Brooks doesn't play around. If you mess up on his block, you're writing statements before the ink dries." It wasn't said with hate, it was said with respect. Daniel took his job seriously. He showed up early, stayed late, and never looked rattled, no matter how chaotic the day became. Daniel hadn't grown up dreaming about working in corrections. In fact, according to old co-workers and people from his hometown near Syracuse, New York, he once wanted to become a state trooper. He joined the police academy but left after failing a final physical exam. He still wanted a job in law enforcement, so when the corrections department opened recruitment, he signed up. "It wasn't the plan," he once told a friend over drinks, "but it pays the bills and gives me a pension." Over the years, what began as a temporary plan became a career. He married young, had a son, then later divorced quietly after 10 years. The divorce papers cited irreconcilable differences, but co-workers said it had more to do with the long hours, the stress, and the fact that prison work changes people. It makes them guarded, cold, and suspicious even outside the job. Daniel once told a new recruit, "Don't take anything at face value in here. Everyone's lying about something, including the staff." In uniform, he projected authority. His posture was straight, his expression unreadable, and his tone controlled. During lineup briefings, he kept his words short. "Do your rounds. Watch your blind spots. Write what you see." He wasn't the kind of officer who yelled or lost his temper. He preferred control through presence. But some inmates noticed something about that calm. It sometimes shifted when he felt comfortable. When he joked, it came off as casual, maybe even kind. But the jokes sometimes crossed lines. Little comments about appearance, gestures that lingered too long when handing over paperwork, compliments that had no place between an officer and an inmate. "You're smarter than most people in here," he once said to an inmate in the library. It wasn't to Tara, but the tone suggested familiarity. Some inmates laughed it off. Others avoided being alone with him. Inside the facility, officers often relied on each other to keep the day running smoothly, and Daniel was known for helping new recruits adjust. He trained others to handle inmates firmly but respectfully. You show fear, they'll use it. You show arrogance, they'll test it. Find the middle ground, he said during an orientation session recorded for new hires. Supervisors appreciated him because he wrote detailed reports and rarely made procedural errors. His name came up in incident reviews not as the problem, but as the stabilizer. Yet underneath that clean record were murmurs that only circulated among a few staff members, about boundaries that sometimes blurred. Nothing serious enough to make it into an official complaint. Just small things brushed off as misunderstandings. The truth was, in corrections, small boundaries matter. And over time, Daniel developed a reputation that split depending on who you asked. Some said he was dependable, even one of the good ones. Others said he was too friendly with certain inmates. His superiors occasionally reminded staff about maintaining professional distance. Everyone knew what that was about, even if no one said his name directly. But no one filed anything formal. Reporting another officer was career suicide. A former sergeant later recalled, "If you said something about Brooks, you'd better have proof. Otherwise, you'd be the one getting transferred." The unspoken rule inside Northwood was clear. As long as things stayed quiet, the system stayed intact. Daniel learned how to use that silence. He never did anything that couldn't be explained. If someone saw him talking privately with an inmate, it was about a job assignment. If he gave someone an extra tray, it was because they missed count. If he spent a little too long near one cell, he'd say it was a security check. Everything had a reason that sounded good on paper. But the pattern was there if you looked closely. Small gestures that, over time, formed a picture of a man who knew the rules well enough to bend them without breaking them outright. Inmates understood that kind of power. They knew who to ask favors from, and they knew who to stay away from. Still, Daniel wasn't the loud, aggressive type. He didn't use threats or public displays of dominance. His control came from subtleties, eye contact, tone, proximity. He would walk into a room, and the mood would shift. He demanded obedience without saying much. And to the administration, that made him an asset. A veteran guard, consistent, effective, and never causing official trouble. It was the kind of officer every warden wanted more of. Yet those who worked closest to him could tell something had changed around February 2020. He seemed distracted, quieter during staff meetings, occasionally smiling at things no one else found funny. A few co-workers assumed it was personal stress. "Maybe it's his ex again," one officer joked in the break room. Another replied, "He'll be fine. Brooks always keeps it together." But in a facility like Northwood, where secrets could hide behind protocol, few people realized how easily control could turn into something else. By April 2020, certain inmates began whispering about favoritism in one of the housing units, the kind that didn't sound innocent. Nothing confirmed, no names spoken too loudly. Just quiet mentions of someone who seemed to be getting privileges others couldn't explain. And though no one connected it to Daniel yet, those whispers would soon reach ears that mattered. What no one knew then was that behind Daniel's calm and discipline was a man who believed he could manage everything. His job, his choices, and the secrets that came with them. It started quietly, almost unnoticeably, in the early months of May 2020 inside Northwood. Tara had been in the facility long enough to understand the rules and the rhythm of the place. She kept to herself, helped women write letters, and avoided unnecessary trouble. That was part of why her first interactions with Officer Daniel Brooks didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary to anyone at first. He was assigned to her unit on rotating shifts, and like every officer, he was supposed to maintain distance, order, and neutrality. But with Daniel, there were small gestures that gave him away long before Tara realized what was happening. On a Monday afternoon during lunch, he placed an extra slice of cornbread on her tray without saying anything. She looked at him briefly, confused, and he simply said, "You missed breakfast. Don't make it a habit." It sounded harmless. It sounded considerate. It sounded like care in a place that was not built to provide any. Over the next few weeks, the gestures multiplied. When Tara stayed behind in the library, finishing up another inmate's grievance letter, Daniel told the clerk, "She's working. Give her 10 more minutes." He started calling her by her first name instead of her inmate number. Once, when an officer in training yelled at Tara for speaking without permission, Daniel stepped in and said, "Relax. She's fine. She's doing what she's supposed to do." Tara had spent most of her life having to earn approval that vanished just as quickly as it was given. So when someone defended her, even in small ways, it meant something. To her, Daniel wasn't crossing boundaries. He was being human in a place where humanity was scarce. She didn't see danger. She saw relief. Conversations followed. At first they were surface level, the weather, the food, the constant noise of the cell block. Then, slowly, Daniel began asking about her past. "You always writing for other people," he said one afternoon during rec hall setup. "Who taught you to do that?" Tara explained how she learned to write clearly because foster care required her to speak for herself at a young age. Daniel nodded and said quietly, "That must have been a lot for a kid." It was the kind of sentence she wasn't used to hearing. Not judgment, just understanding. Tara didn't talk much about her feelings, but she talked to him. Not because she thought she could trust him, but because she wanted to believe there was someone on the inside who didn't see her as just another inmate. Other inmates noticed first. One woman from Tara's housing unit pulled her aside in the laundry room and said, "Don't get comfortable. Officers don't help you unless they want something back." Another told her, "I've seen girls think a guard was their friend. They always end up paying for it." Tara brushed the warnings away. She told herself that they didn't know him. She believed he was different. The women shook their heads. They had seen this story before. They knew how it ended. But Tara didn't want to hear it. Not after everything she had survived. Not when this was the first time in years she felt chosen. By June 2020, the shift from attention to something private had already taken place. Daniel began leaving brief notes for her. Small slips of paper tucked beneath books she borrowed from the library cart or slid under cleaning supplies in the hallway closet. Nothing elaborate, just words like, "You're stronger than you think," or "I look forward to seeing you today." Tara saved each one. She kept them pressed between pages of a dictionary she used to help other inmates write. It wasn't the words that mattered. It was the fact that someone was speaking to her as if she was worth something. Meanwhile, Daniel became bolder in ways that stayed just inside the edge of deniability. He positioned himself near her work assignments. He walked slower past her cell. He asked questions that were meant for only her to answer. Then came the first explicit line crossed. During a late cleaning rotation one evening, when most women were already locked in for count, Daniel approached her in the hallway. He didn't touch her. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "If you ever feel unsafe in here, you come to me. I'll make sure nothing happens to you." It was a promise of protection, but also a declaration of power. Tara heard it as comfort. What she did not hear, what she could not hear, was the control embedded inside it. From that moment, she didn't just trust him, she depended on him. The emotional tie did not take long to form after that. Tara began shifting her behavior without realizing it. She stayed quiet when other officers made mistakes in the unit because she didn't want anything jeopardizing Daniel's job. She avoided friendships that could make her vulnerable or raise suspicion. She even adjusted her daily schedule to coincide with his shifts, telling herself it was coincidence. But others saw it clearly. One inmate told another during yard time, "She's protecting him now. That's when the trouble starts." Because once an inmate begins protecting a guard, the power dynamic has already tilted. The guard controls not just the environment, but the emotional equilibrium. Daniel knew this. He had seen it before, maybe not with Tara, but with others. And yet, he didn't stop. Instead, he deepened the connection. He pulled her aside one afternoon and said the words that would lock her to him completely. "When you get out of here, I'll be there. You won't have to start over alone." For someone whose entire life was defined by being left behind, that vow was everything. Tara believed him. She believed that he saw her as more than inmate. 74281. She believed that this connection, this bond, was real. What she did not understand was that the moment she believed she needed him, she no longer recognized the danger she was in. Because in prison, the most powerful chains are not the steel ones. They are the ones that come disguised as comfort. The shift was gradual, and that was what made it so effective. By late June 2020, Daniel was no longer simply an officer who offered Tara small kindnesses. He was now the person she adjusted her days around, the person she looked for before she stepped into the common area, the person whose approval mattered more than anyone else's in the facility. Tara didn't recognize the change in herself. She told herself that she was just being cautious, that she was managing the situation in a way that kept things from becoming obvious. But the truth was that Daniel had become part of her emotional life in a place where emotional connection was nearly impossible. And once that happened, the balance of power shifted entirely in his direction. Daniel understood this. He began to shape the relationship into something that required loyalty. It started with subtle phrases. One afternoon, after Tara laughed at something another inmate said in the yard, Daniel found an excuse to speak to her during hallway rotations. Keeping his tone low, he told her, "You don't need to be close to anyone else in here. You know they talk. They'll twist things and use them against you." Tara nodded, not because she believed him fully, but because she didn't want to upset him. That was the first sign that fear was now influencing her decisions. Not fear of punishment, but fear of losing the one person who made her feel valued. From that point on, the conversations began carrying weight. When Tara hesitated to share something about her day, Daniel would press. "I just want to understand you," he said once, while standing just outside the laundry room. When she did open up, he listened closely, but later reminded her of those details in ways that made her feel exposed. What had once felt comforting gradually became uncomfortable, yet Tara couldn't identify why. She still believed this was connection. She still believed he cared. But caring had turned into monitoring. Trust had turned into compliance. Then came the first direct statement of control. During an evening shift in early July, Daniel approached Tara after lights out, speaking through the doorframe while the hall officer was on break. "Listen to me," he said quietly. "If anyone asks you about me, you say we barely talk. You know how this place is. They'll twist it and mess everything up. And they will believe me over you. That's not a threat. That's reality." The sentence was simple, clear, and direct. And it worked. Tara felt a coldness in her chest, but she also told herself he was right. She had been in the system long enough to know how accusations played out. Inmate versus officer was never a fair comparison. This marked the beginning of emotional isolation. Tara stopped spending time with women she previously talked to in the day room. She avoided group activities she once joined. Inmates noticed the shift and responded the way prison culture teaches them to respond, by keeping distance. One woman told her during mail call, "You're getting yourself into something you won't be able to walk away from." Tara didn't argue. She simply said, "I'm fine." The inmate responded, "Nobody in here is ever just fine." And then she walked away. That warning sat with Tara longer than she expected, but not long enough to change anything. As Tara became more emotionally tethered to Daniel, her sense of self began to erode. She stopped writing letters for others because she didn't want to disappoint him by being unavailable. She adjusted her library visits to match the times he was on duty. She spent more time in her room, thinking, waiting, anticipating. She told herself she was making choices. She didn't yet understand that she was losing the ability to make them freely. The trauma bond was forming, the psychological link between affection and fear, attachment and anxiety, reassurance and dependence. Meanwhile, other officers began to notice the strange familiarity between Daniel and Tara. They didn't speak about it directly. They didn't intervene. They simply shifted their posture and looked the other way. One officer, while reviewing unit assignments, remarked quietly to another, "Brooks has got himself one of those situations again." The second officer shrugged and responded, "As long as he keeps it quiet, we don't have to deal with it." That was the policy no supervisor wrote, but every staff member understood. Do not challenge another officer unless you are prepared to take on the entire institution. Tara didn't know these conversations were happening, but she could feel the tension in small ways. When some officers saw her, their eyes lingered too long. When others passed her, they avoided acknowledgement altogether. She wasn't being protected. She was being marked. She had stepped into a dynamic that the prison recognized instantly, even if she didn't. And once an inmate is marked, everything becomes unstable. Daniel continued reinforcing the idea that he was her only reliable source of support. If Tara showed even the slightest frustration or sadness, he responded with, "You know I'm the only one here who cares about you. Don't forget that." The language was soft, never shouted, never aggressive, but weighted with threat. Tara did not feel safe walking away from him, but more importantly, she did not yet believe she had the right to walk away. She had learned to survive abandonment by clinging instead of letting go, and Daniel was exploiting that wound with precision. By mid-July 2020, Tara's emotional world had narrowed to one person. She didn't think about the future. She didn't think about the risks. She only thought about maintaining the connection. And because no one intervened, because no system protected her, because the silence of Northwood was stronger than any spoken warning, the bond continued tightening. Tara was no longer choosing Daniel. She was depending on him. She didn't understand yet that dependency cannot coexist with safety. And soon, very soon, Daniel would act on his belief that he owned her. It was July 17th, 2020, a Friday night, when the tone inside Northwood felt different, although no one could say exactly why at first. Count had ended at 9 p.m. The lights were dimmed for quiet hours, and most inmates had settled into their routine of writing, lying down, or whispering quietly through cell vents. Tara was in her cell on the C block, a section known for being one of the calmer units, partly because the women there had adjusted to the prison system and understood how to avoid unnecessary conflicts. But that night, something happened that broke every rule Northwood claimed to stand on. The security log, a time-stamped list of officer movements, showed that Officer Daniel Brooks was seen near Tara's cell hallway at 9:47 p.m., long after he was supposed to have completed his final walkthrough. The log didn't show him entering any other cell on the block, just hers. Normally, cameras in the C block corridor ran continuously, providing a clear feed to the control room. But at 9:51 p.m., the hallway camera went offline. The official report later read, "Camera malfunction due to power relay interference." Officers familiar with the system knew this was unusual. Those cameras were wired separately and rarely failed unless tampered with. One officer on the radios that night said later during testimony, "When a camera goes dark in that building, you pay attention. Somebody wanted to move without being seen." But at the time, no one acted. The silence among staff that had been closing around Tara and Daniel for weeks now played its most dangerous role. Inside her cell, Tara did not scream. There were no loud noises reported by other inmates in nearby units. The walls were thick, the door was steel, and trauma does not always sound like panic. What happened in that room occurred in silence, silence built by fear, loyalty, and emotional entanglement that had slowly erased Tara's ability to say no. When officers later tried to reconstruct the timeline, they noted that Tara had shown no behavioral issues earlier that day. No signs of agitation, no argument, no trigger, which meant the violence she experienced didn't come from conflict. It came from control. At 10:18 p.m., during a brief shift rotation in the control room, the camera feed came back online. Daniel was no longer in the hallway. The log showed he had keyed out of the unit at 10:06 p.m. The sheet noted nothing unusual. Everything appeared normal. But at 6:41 a.m. the next morning, when officers opened cells for morning meds and roll call, Tara did not respond. She was found on the floor near the back wall, her body positioned awkwardly, her breathing shallow, and a pool of blood spreading across the cell floor beneath her. The trail ran from the mattress to where she lay, dark against the concrete. The sight was so severe that one officer froze for a moment before calling for help. Another grabbed the radio, voice shaking as he shouted, "Inmate down in C block, heavy bleeding. We need medical now." Tara was taken to the prison's medical unit, where nurse Angela Reed was the first to examine her. Angela later described the moment on record. She was conscious, but barely. She was shaking. Her eyes looked like she didn't know where she was. The medical examination confirmed that her vagina was torn, with extensive lacerations and internal bleeding. Doctors noted that the tearing was deep enough to suggest violent, forced penetration using significant physical power. There were also bruises along her inner thighs and hips, and nail abrasion marks on her palms, signs she had tried to fight back or brace herself. The examiner's report stated bluntly, injuries consistent with sexual assault, not accidental trauma. These wounds could only have been caused by an act of extreme force, not a fall or misstep in a shower as later claimed. When Daniel was questioned, he provided a simple explanation. He claimed that Tara had fallen in the shower. He said he was called to check the unit earlier in the night and saw nothing concerning. During the internal incident report, he stated, "She told me she slipped. That's all I know." But the shower in C block was shared among 6 cells and had a camera pointed directly at the entrance. No one had been seen entering or leaving at the time he claimed, and the injuries Tara suffered were not the type sustained from a fall. Medical documentation later read, "Injuries inconsistent with reported mechanism." Tara was barely able to speak during the initial medical exam. When asked if she needed help or if someone hurt her, she said only one thing: "Don't. Please. Don't." It was not a denial. It was fear. Fear of retaliation. Fear of disbelief. Fear of the same system that had raised her, processed her, sentenced her, and now stood between her and justice. And because she said no specific name at that moment, the administration treated the injuries as undetermined source pending review. That phrasing was common in Northwood. It was the kind of wording used when staff needed time to decide how to handle cases that could damage the institution if mishandled. When inmates heard what happened, the whispers started immediately. Some said they saw Daniel lingering in the hallway the night before. Others said they heard footsteps that didn't match routine. One inmate in the cell next to Tara said quietly, "She sounded like she was trying not to make noise, like she was holding her breath." But no one filed a formal statement. Everyone knew what happened to inmates who accused officers without protection. Retaliation wasn't always physical. Sometimes it was losing visits, losing phone access, losing your job assignment that gave you small dignity. It didn't have to be violent to be painful. In the official daily incident briefing the next morning, the warden was told inmate Mills sustained injuries from a fall. No mention of blood loss levels, no mention of camera outages, no mention of logs showing Daniel near her cell. The report was sanitized before it was even complete. That is how the system operated. Present the smallest version of the truth and hope no one looks deeper. But Nurse Angela did not let it go. That morning, while helping stabilize Tara, she looked directly into her eyes and said, "You didn't fall, did you?" Tara didn't answer. She just closed her eyes. Angela later wrote in her private notes, "She didn't speak, but her silence was the loudest truth in the room." Those notes would soon become the reason the truth came out at all. Because before Northwood could bury this incident permanently, one person was about to break the silence. The morning after Tara was found, the prison moved quickly, not to investigate, but to control the narrative. Within hours of her medical examination, the administration issued a directive labeling the incident as injury from an accidental fall. That phrasing was carefully chosen. It was just vague enough to end questions, and just official enough to discourage staff from talking. The warden met with supervisors behind closed doors, and according to the shift roster notes from July 18, 2020, the instruction was clear. Minimal discussion. Paperwork routed through administration only. The goal was not to find out what happened. The goal was to keep the institution stable, even if that meant erasing the truth. Tara was moved from the general housing unit to solitary confinement, placed under what was described in official terms as protective observation. But every inmate in Northwood knew what that really meant. Solitary was where you sent someone to quiet them, to separate them from witnesses, to make sure they did not talk. The cell was a small concrete room with nothing but a thin mattress, a toilet, and a heavy steel door. The lights were left on around the clock. There was no conversation, no human contact, no support. When Tara was escorted there, she barely spoke, still weak from what had happened. One officer walking her there said quietly, "You'll be okay." But the tone suggested something else. Don't speak. Don't accuse. Don't make noise. Meanwhile, the incident report written by the responding officer was edited twice before it was finalized. Where the original description noted visible blood saturation, the revised report changed it to minor bleeding. Where the medical report described internal tearing and bruising consistent with force, the administrative summary reduced it to abrasions of unclear origin. The language was not a mistake. It was a system deciding which truth it would allow. Northwood had been audited before for allegations of staff misconduct, and each time, the institution survived because records were shaped to benefit the staff, not the inmates. Nurse Angela Reed had worked in that prison for nearly 7 years. She knew the culture well. She had seen inmates come in with bruises that didn't match the stories written on incident forms. She had treated women who were too terrified to speak. But when she saw Tara that morning, shaking, eyes unfocused, struggling to stay conscious, Angela felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Urgency. Angela asked Tara, "Did someone do this to you?" Tara didn't answer with words. Instead, she lowered her face and covered it with her hands. It wasn't a denial. It was fear. And fear is often louder than truth. Angela knew that if the administration controlled all documentation, the case would never leave the building. So she made a decision that would put her job, possibly her safety, at risk. She printed a second copy of Tara's medical report before it was submitted to the facility database. She took photographs of the injuries using a state-issued camera from the medical unit, logging the photos under general documentation to avoid suspicion. Then she stored the copies in her personal bag and walked out of the prison that afternoon, knowing she could not bring them back inside. Later, she would say, "Someone needed to care whether she lived or died. At that moment, that someone was me." Word began to spread quietly among inmates about Tara's sudden transfer to solitary. No official explanation was given, but women in prison understand silence better than any official memo. One inmate whispered to another during laundry rotation, "They're shutting her away. That means staff is involved." Another responded, "Nobody gets put in the hole for a fall." These conversations were brief, guarded, always aware of who might be listening. But they revealed something that administration could not control. The inmates believed Tara before she ever spoke. Angela spent the next 2 days looking for someone outside the prison who could help. She knew internal channels would either ignore her or retaliate. So she reached out to a prison advocacy group she had heard about during a medical ethics training, an organization focused on reporting sexual abuse and misconduct in correctional facilities. The group was Just Care Alliance, a real nonprofit that has worked on cases involving inmate abuse in multiple states. Angela sent an encrypted email attaching the photographs and redacted medical forms, writing, "I believe an inmate has been assaulted by staff. I cannot report internally. I need guidance." The response came within hours. "Do not speak to administration. Do not request follow-up meetings. We will contact federal oversight." Angela knew that once external investigators became involved, the institution would turn its focus toward identifying who leaked the information. She also knew she could not back out, because once someone chooses to tell the truth in a place designed to silence, everything that comes after is consequence. The warden received a notice of external inquiry 3 days later. The room went tense. Administrators began reviewing logs, camera records, staff schedules, looking for a version of events that could be defended. Daniel was called into a meeting, not as a suspect, but as a witness. He kept his tone casual, controlled. He said, "She told me she slipped. That's all I know." The supervisors nodded. His story fit the narrative they were trying to hold. But something else had changed. For the first time, the silence around him did not feel secure. In solitary, Tara finally spoke. When a mental health counselor conducted a mandatory wellness check, she asked quietly, "If I tell you something, will I be punished?" The counselor responded carefully, "You have the right to be safe. That's all I can say." Tara took a breath. Her voice cracked. It wasn't an accident. Those 4 words were the beginning of the truth being spoken out loud. When the Just Care Alliance received Angela's documentation, they did not hesitate. Within 48 hours, they issued a public statement to local media outlets stating that an inmate at Northwood Women's Correctional Facility had suffered severe injuries under suspicious circumstances. They did not release Tara's name, but they didn't need to. The idea that a woman inside had been hurt, possibly assaulted, spread faster than officials could contain it. By July 21, 2020, local news stations were camped outside the prison gates demanding comment. The warden released a short written statement calling the claim unverified and under internal review, but by that point, the story was no longer theirs to control. Public outrage grew when a state representative known for advocating prison oversight reposted the news, writing, "If this happened inside, the public deserves answers." Suddenly, Northwood was no longer just a prison. It was a spotlight. Former inmates began reaching out to reporters, sharing stories about officers who crossed boundaries, about complaints that never went anywhere, about silence being the unspoken rule. One woman who served time in Northwood spoke to a news anchor and said plainly, "If a guard wants you, there's nowhere to go." The institution's attempt to hide what happened was now seen for exactly what it was, a cover. The New York State Department of Corrections assigned external investigators to the case, and the first thing they requested were Tara's medical records and the camera logs. When they reviewed the hallway camera outage on July 17th, they flagged it as suspicious. The timing lined up exactly with the documented sighting of Daniel near Tara's cell. Investigators also reviewed the shower camera footage, which showed that Tara had not entered the shower at any point during the period Daniel claimed. The story he gave over and over, "She slipped, I just helped her up," collapsed in less than a day. The timeline did not match. The physical injuries did not match. The surveillance evidence did not match. DNA testing was ordered on the bedding and clothing taken from Tara's cell. The test results returned 1 week later, confirming the presence of male DNA, specifically DNA linked to Daniel Brooks. When investigators confronted him, his tone changed. Where he had once been calm and confident, he now became defensive. He said, "She wanted it. She came to me. I didn't force anything." That sentence became the turning point in the investigation, because his claim was one the law takes very seriously, and it carries a clear legal definition. There is no such thing as consent between an inmate and an officer in a correctional environment. Under state and federal law, any sexual contact between them is considered assault due to power imbalance. As investigators continued interviewing staff, more warning signs emerged. Several officers admitted, off the record, that they had noticed Daniel spending extra time in C Block. One officer recalled seeing Tara and Daniel speaking during a library detail months earlier. The officer told investigators, "I didn't think it was my place to say something." That sentence revealed a critical truth. The silence was systemic. The prison was not just a place where the assault happened. It was a place that made the assault possible. Every quiet moment, every brushed-off comment, every overlooked boundary violation added up to that night. Daniel tried to salvage his reputation by framing Tara as manipulative. He claimed she flirted, that she intentionally sought him out, that she threatened to make trouble if he didn't keep giving her favors. But investigators had something stronger than his statements. They had patterns. They reviewed handwritten notes Tara kept from before the assault. The handwriting analysis confirmed they were hers, and the language was vulnerable, emotional, hopeful. They found no threats, no coercion from her. Instead, they found the clear emotional dependency of someone who believed she had finally found protection inside a world built to break her. His narrative began to look less like defense and more like control. The prison administration now faced scrutiny that reached beyond Daniel. State oversight agencies questioned the facility's staff training, reporting structure, and grievance handling. Emails surfaced showing that 2 officers had reported discomfort with Daniel's behavior months earlier, but were told by a supervisor, "Don't make problems where there aren't any." That message would later become a centerpiece of public hearings. Northwood, once seen as a well-run facility, now looked like a place where misconduct didn't just happen, it was allowed to happen. Meanwhile, Tara slowly began speaking with investigators. Her statements came out carefully, unevenly, sometimes stopping mid-sentence. She described how things shifted from attention to pressure, from affection to control, from choice to fear. She said, "I thought he cared. Then I realized I couldn't say no." Her words were not theatrical. They were quiet. And that quiet made them impossible to ignore. Trauma is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is often small, hesitant, and deeply real. As the investigation progressed, the public no longer saw this case as a single incident. They saw it as proof of a larger issue. News anchors reported, "This case raises questions about oversight in correctional institutions statewide." Advocacy groups held protests outside the Department of Corrections headquarters calling for accountability. And within Northwood, staff who once avoided the topic now whispered among themselves, afraid of being subpoenaed, afraid of being implicated, afraid of what else might come out. The weight of the evidence against Daniel grew heavy. It was no longer just Tara's injuries or the DNA or the logs. It was the entire environment that pointed to a pattern of crossed boundaries and ignored warnings. This case was no longer contained inside the prison walls. The institution itself was now being examined, questioned, and challenged in a way that could not be reversed. The trial took place in December of 2020, 5 months after the night Tara was found in her cell. By the time jury selection began, the public already knew who Daniel Brooks was and what he had been accused of. The courtroom was full on the first day, not because people were eager to see justice, but because the story had shaken the trust in the prison system across the state. Tara sat at the witness table with her attorney beside her, her hands shaking, her breathing unsteady, but her eyes forward. She had been asked many times whether she was sure she wanted to testify. Each time she answered the same thing. "If I don't say it, he gets to keep doing it." When Tara took the stand, there was no dramatic pause, no movie-like entrance. She spoke quietly, with her voice occasionally breaking, but she spoke clearly. She explained how the relationship began with attention and conversation, how it shifted into expectation, pressure, and fear. She did not use complicated language to describe what happened. She said, "I thought he cared about me. Then I realized I couldn't say no anymore." The courtroom was silent as she spoke. Even the defense attorney did not interrupt her during the most difficult parts. The defense attempted to portray Tara as manipulative, as someone who... Before moving on, a quick thank you to everyone watching and supporting this channel. Your presence truly keeps it alive. This community continues to grow because of people who believe in real, meaningful storytelling. Becoming a channel member unlocks exclusive extras, behind-the-scenes content, and directly helps us bring more powerful true stories to light. Your support makes a real difference. And we'd love to know who's here. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. If you're still tuned in right now, write "I'm still here" in the comments. Let's see who's watching till the end. Don't forget to like this video too. Now, let's continue. Sought special treatment. They argued she wanted food privileges, room assignments, and emotional connection. They suggested that she seduced Daniel, that she used her vulnerability as leverage. But every time they pushed that angle, the prosecution reminded the court of one undeniable legal fact. An inmate cannot consent to sexual contact with a correctional officer. Under state and federal law, the power imbalance makes consent legally impossible. Anger rose among the spectators when the prosecutor repeated, "No inmate can seduce a guard. The guard already holds the power." The most damaging evidence for Daniel came from the DNA test results, the security logs, and the camera outage timeline. Technical specialists explained clearly how the camera in C Block did not fail by accident. A corrections technology supervisor testified that the outage was manual override only. That meant someone physically turned it off. When asked who had access to the override panel, the supervisor answered, "Only on-duty officers assigned to the block." And on that night, there was only one. Daniel testified as well. His voice was flat, his tone rehearsed. He repeated the same claim. She fell in the shower. I helped her. That's all. But the prosecution challenged him with one question that changed the energy of the courtroom. Then why were you in her hallway after lockdown, when your duty log shows no assigned tasks there? Daniel paused. He did not answer. The silence was louder than any confession. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours, a short time for a case of this magnitude. When they returned, the courtroom could feel that the decision had already settled deeply among them. Daniel Brooks was found guilty on all major charges: first-degree sexual assault, abuse of power under state correctional authority, obstruction of justice for tampering with documentation and camera access. The judge sentenced him to 28 years in federal prison. The irony was not lost on anyone. He would now live under the same conditions he once controlled. Some spectators felt relief. Some felt anger. Some felt that even 28 years was not enough. But one thing was clear. The silence that protected him for years had finally broken. Tara did not attend the sentencing hearing. She had been released on parole earlier that month, her 6-year sentence completed. But her release was not freedom. She carried trauma, trust wounds, and fear of enclosed spaces. She struggled to sleep at night and often woke up shaking, not from dreams, but from the memory of being trapped with no voice. Yet she refused to disappear. In the months following the trial, she joined prison reform groups and advocacy networks focused on inmate protection. She spoke at community panels, shared her story with survivor groups, and dedicated herself to making sure others did not go unheard. She said during one interview, "People assume everyone in prison deserves whatever happens to them in there, but nobody deserves to be hurt, ignored, or treated like their life doesn't matter. I made mistakes, but I didn't deserve that." Her voice was still soft when she spoke, but it no longer shook. Angela Reed, the nurse who recorded Tara's injuries, also became part of the public conversation. She testified at the trial. She faced disciplinary review for breaking internal procedure, but was ultimately cleared. When asked why she risked her career, she said, "Because someone had to do the right thing. That's supposed to mean something." And yet, even after the conviction, even after media attention, even after official statements and public outrage, one question remained. How many others were silenced before Tara? Evidence later revealed that Daniel had been the subject of informal complaints years earlier, but none were documented. Whispers had been ignored. Boundaries had been crossed quietly, and the system had looked away. Tara survived. She found her voice again. She rebuilt her life, even with scars that don't fade. But behind the walls of Northwood, and prisons like it across the country, silence still lives. How many were hurt and never believed? How many tried to speak and were buried under paperwork and procedure? How many officers crossed lines because they knew no one would stop them? Tara once said, "They locked me up to teach me a lesson, but the real criminal wore a badge." And that is the question that remains. When the system that claims to protect becomes the one that harms, who will protect the people inside?